Welcome to the next episode of Great War Story, and this is part two of my story of Valerie Goodchild and the New Zealand Army in the Great War. Part one was about my discovery of Mrs. Goodchild and how I researched her and the various people I encountered. Part two is really the results of what I could learn about what she was doing, where she was, and also a lot of, well, side stories. You know, I love my little interesting side stories because sometimes I just know that she was in a certain time, in a certain place, and the only way to flesh out her story is to get a sense of what other people were doing in that location and what was going on in the same time and same place, and things that she must have encountered or things that must have reflected on her experiences. Now, this is going to be a big one, so let's get down to it. So, as I've already indicated in episode one of Mrs. Goodchild, the whole thing started with a single entry in the war diary of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. My grandfather, as you probably know by now, was in the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance in Egypt in 1915, and Mrs. Goodchild was starting using her motor ambulance, which was very useful. Now, it got me thinking, why was a civilian female from the civilian population, the expat population living in Egypt, given a chance to even do anything with the army? You know, this is 1914, 1915, not exactly a time of women's lib and all the rest. But on the other hand, New Zealand was the first country in the world to give women the vote. And if you actually go to New Zealand and look at the $10 note, you'll see that Kate Shepherd, who was a notable suffragette in the 19th century in New Zealand, played a big role, and she is remembered on the $10 note. Now, this is the last $10 note I remember using in New Zealand. I think there's a more up-to-date one now, but Kate Shepherd is still on it. So in that sense, I was thinking perhaps New Zealanders were more inclined to give women a place, give women a role, than perhaps some of the other countries that were a bit slower to give women the vote. That was the first thought I had. Now, the second thought I had was the presence of Mrs. Godley. General Godley was the general in charge of the New Zealand expedition. He was aboard the same ship as my grandfather, the Maunganui, that left Wellington in October of 1914. And quite interestingly, he took his wife along with him. So she was on that whole voyage and she was with him in Egypt. So the presence of Lady Godley, Lady Louisa Godley, may also have contributed because, well, we know that she had an interest in the hospitals and caring for the wounded men, and it could well have been the presence of Lady Godley that made the New Zealanders a little bit more inclined to, well, give women a go. And here we have a story from the Wanganui Chronicle, a New Zealand newspaper, July 30th, 1915, about Lady Godley's Hospital. Some account by Colonel Essen, AQMG, that's Assistant Quartermaster General, in a letter to the Defence Minister. The New Zealand Convalescent Home under the management of Lady Godley is a splendid little institution, he writes, and Lady Godley with a small staff is doing great work in completing the cure of men discharged from hospital, who require rest and building up before they take the field again. These homes are most necessary, as at this time of year life in Egypt under canvas or outside a stone building is almost impossible. Yesterday, even in Alexandria, which was on the coast, it was 109 degrees in the shade, and the sick in the convalescent camp suffered a good deal. Ever since her arrival in Egypt, Lady Godley has taken a very keen and sympathetic interest in our sick, and has never spared herself when working on their behalf. I have not met a more business-like member of the fair sex, nor one in whom the faculty of management was so highly developed. Good discipline maintained in the home and of the institution is dictated by the head as well as the heart. The home is an immense success, an absolute necessity, and New Zealanders have much reason to be grateful to their General's good lady for what she has undertaken to do on behalf of their boys, instead of leaving for England or some cooler place, which is the course invariably followed during the summer by all who can possibly get away. So perhaps again it was the example of Lady Godley, and perhaps the pressure put on her husband, that meant that when a female civilian volunteered her services, the New Zealanders would make use of it and I suspect perhaps some of the other nationalities, particularly the English, I imagine, would have been less inclined to say, yes, we could use your help. And, well, as you know, I always like to look up these people. So who was this James Jacob Essen, the Assistant Quartermaster General? Well, he is in fact in this photo. That's him right there. And interesting enough, it always seems to come back to my granddad's transport ship that took him to war, the Monganui. General Godley was aboard the Monganui, and it turns out that James Essen was also aboard the Monganui. Sometimes I think my grandfather was a little bit like the movie Forrest Gump, where Forrest Gump wasn't the main leader, but he always seemed to be there in the background when important events were going on. And there he is as a Mason later in life, and he actually rose to become quite a senior New Zealand government civil servant, serving as Secretary of the Treasury from 1922 to 1925. Now, the main hospital in Cairo that the New Zealanders were using at this point was the Pont de Cuba Hospital. You may remember I made reference to that when it was written on the back of one of the photos that showed Valerie Goodchild. And this is what the Pont de Cuba Hospital actually looked like at the time. And I managed to find a number of photos of it. This one was from a source I hadn't previously used much before, but the Nelson Provincial Museum happened to have a rather good photo of the Pont de Cuba Hospital. And this one was a photo that's described as being the front entrance. Looks a little bit different, but, well, that's what the caption said. And let's go to another New Zealand newspaper, the Dominion, October 30th, 1915, New Zealand Hospital in Egypt. Mr. A. Russell, formerly house steward at Christchurch Hospital, now stationed at the New Zealand General Hospital, Pont de Cuba, Abasia, Cairo, writes to a friend near Christchurch as follows. We have taken charge of a very large hospital, formerly the Egyptian Army Hospital. It is all New Zealand wounded we have, and all the staff, doctors, nurses and orderlies are from New Zealand. We have several of the Christchurch Hospital nurses and doctors here. We have close on 800 wounded in just now. The other night we got 241 in at one time, and last night 31. When the boys get a bit well, we sent them to Port Said to a New Zealand convalescent camp until they're fit to return to the front. Cases that are likely to take a long time, we send to a New Zealand hospital in England. There are thousands and thousands of soldiers training here, and everything is warlike in appearance. Red Cross motor ambulances, some with lady drivers, horse and motor transports, and everything connected with ambulance work are to be seen about the streets all day long, and every other day we see a regiment off to the Dardanelles. We are on the main street, so they all pass here. The men are happy and sing on their way to the station, and those in hospital are also cheery and happy, and anxious to get back to the firing line again. Now, that's a very interesting comment there about lady drivers. Now, I wonder about that plural, because aside from Valerie Goodchild, I have never found any evidence for any other females driving ambulances in Egypt. Later in England, there were quite a number of female ambulance drivers. I mentioned Deborah Pitts-Taylor, but this early on in 1915, I don't know of any other females. It could be the case where, a bit of rhetorical exaggeration, that there was one lady driver and he just dropped in the plural to make it sound more impressive. I don't know. We use here daily 430 chickens, 3,000 eggs, 400 loaves of bread, 160 pounds of meat, and 1,300 pints of milk, to say nothing of other things. The men are well looked after and get plenty to smoke. Well, that's always interesting, isn't it? The attitude to smoking was rather different there. You can't imagine an officer writing back to New Zealand and say, well, it's okay, we make sure the men get all the cigarettes they need. Now, another story about this hospital, which Valerie Goodchild must have been helping. She would have been driving sick men from the camps to the Pont de Cuba Hospital and so on and so on. And this is a story from the Poverty Bay Herald, another New Zealand newspaper from October the 2nd, 1915. For non-New Zealanders, you may think that's rather an odd name for a place, Poverty Bay. That is a story that goes back to Captain Cook, the discoverer of New Zealand. And he went to the Bay of Plenty, and the native peoples were rather generous and friendly there and helped him resupply his ship. When he went to Poverty Bay, the Maoris he encountered there were rather hostile, and he wasn't able to get supplies, so he got his revenge by naming that location Poverty Bay. Let's move on. A glimpse of the life in the New Zealand base hospital at Pont de Cuba is given by Nurse Netzi of Northcote. This week our hospital has been enlarged, or rather crowded up, with 100 more beds, Nurse Nutzi wrote. You may notice the variant spelling. That's not a typo by me. The newspaper story calls her both Netzi and Nutzi. I got rather frustrated trying to locate a Nurse Netzi. There was not a single person in the military files or anywhere else called Netzi, and I almost gave up in despair, assuming that it was like a nickname for maybe Betsy, and her name was Elizabeth. And goodness me, how could you find a nurse called Elizabeth with no more clue than that to go by? Fortunately, I actually found her under the name Nutzi. The second spelling is the correct one. Let's carry on. This week, our hospital has been enlarged, or rather crowded up, with 100 more beds, Nurse Nutzi wrote. We have news to expect a large number of fresh patients of diverse nationalities coming shortly, so those of our boys who are well enough will have to go on to a convalescent hospital. We do grudge giving out boys to other hospitals, and the boys themselves would rather sleep on the floors than keep others away. They're really funny when they first come in from the firing line. As soon as they're shown their beds, ill as they are, they'll go all over the hospital to see if they know anyone. We look high and low for them to see the doctors. They all come back in time, and after a lot of persuasion, get into bed. The convalescent ones then get them the New Zealand newspapers, and for the rest of the day one can scarcely get yes or no out of them. After they have devoured these, then you can get them to talk about their adventures. And I don't know about you, but I feel from the tone and the way she writes that Nurse Nutzi was quite a funny lady who could see the jokes and would be smiling and making jokes with the boys. And, well, I've got a number of photos of her, and I think you'll agree that the personality type you see coming through her words is also reflected in her photos. That's about the most serious photo I found of her. Actually, there's Nurse Nutzi from the New Zealand Military Nursing homepage. And I even found out what her nickname was in Egypt, because two of these photos, the one at the top left was had captioned Nutty at Abakir, and the one on the bottom right was described as Nutty at Zaytun. So her nickname, Nurse Nutzi, she was called Nutty by her friends. And look at that, every single photo, look at her hanging out the window on the bottom left. She's got this naughty smile on her face. It's actually a nice contrast, because so often when you see these all black and white photos, everybody's so serious, but you can see the life and the animation coming through in all of her photos. Now, the Auckland War Memorial Museum has something called the online cenotaph, and they often have a brief biography or details of people who served in World War I. And every now and again, there will be some extra comments. I, for example, made some extra comments against my grandfather's entry on the online cenotaph. And against Nurse Nutzi's one, I found something written by one of her relatives. And this is what Moana wrote. Our great-great-aunt Emily May Nutzi was a woman of great courage. She lost her elder brother Charles to the Great War and never married. She was a staff nurse in World War I and later matron-in-chief in World War II. Yes, she went back to Egypt in the 1940s. You made a difference with your calm, steady ways and understanding leadership. Warm thoughts and blessings with you, Moana. So what? That would be the great-great-niece of Emily May Nutzi. And as I was researching it, I was delighted to find that she actually received quite an honour. She lived in Northcote on the north shore of Auckland. You can see I've put it on the map on the left there. And the Northcote City Council, or Borough Council, I guess it would have been back then, decided to name a street after her, Nutzi Avenue. And for me in particular, that's interesting because my elder brother lives on the North Shore. And when I go to New Zealand, I drive over the Harbour Bridge and I go up Oniwa Road. You can see there at the bottom of the map. And I would have driven past Nutzi Ave, I don't know how many times, in going back and forth to my elder brother's house, just after the Northcote Primary School. And I wonder if anybody who lives on Nutzi Ave has even stopped to think about where the street got its name. Well, it was named after Nurse Nutzi. And, well, why did she get a street named after her? It wasn't just for her World War I service. Emily May Nutzi. 1928 to 1940, she was Lady Superintendent of Auckland Hospital. Nutsy's appointment came at a time when a younger generation of nurses was challenging much of the rigid discipline traditionally associated with the profession. Her first task was to calm the troubles and insubordination that had led to the resignation of her predecessor. Nutsy's unflappable manner, her ability to mediate between the hospital board and her staff, and her willingness to adapt the rigid traditions of nursing to the demands of the 1930s enabled Auckland Hospital to build and maintain good staff morale over difficult times. Well, it seems funny to us today. We're used to the idea of, liberal-minded people pushing boundaries and challenging traditional conservative ways. But when we think of the 1930s, we tend to think of that as being a time of, staid conservative tradition. And it's interesting to see this brief description of these upheavals that were going on in the nursing tradition at the time, and Emily Nutsey having the job of trying to keep it calm and keep it all together. Now, the photos on the right are from 1943 in Egypt. As I mentioned, she went back in World War II as matron in charge, but she suffered from ill health, and in 1943 she basically was medically discharged and returned to New Zealand. And these photos from her farewell ceremony in Egypt just before she returned to New Zealand in 1943. There. And it was in 1949 that the Northcote Council formally named the street after Nutsey Ave. Now, back to some more newspapers. New Zealand Times, May 20th, 1915. Sick in Egypt, how they're treated. In continuation of what has already been published with reference to the outrageous stories that have been circulated about sick New Zealand soldiers in Egypt being treated by territorials and nursed by Arabs, the following is extracted from a report of the Egyptian Army Hospital for Defence by General Godley. Now, first comment there, well, you can see the old racism and, well, the nature of the times was, oh dear, what a disgraceful thing that our New Zealand boys might be nursed by Arabs. Oh dear, we couldn't have that, could we? Now, the territorials they're referring to, well, it's quite accurate. I already mentioned the critical shortage they had. They didn't have any New Zealand nurses, few enough doctors, and the territorials were the Royal Army Medical Corps from England. Remember, I mentioned in some other previous episodes, there were a lot of territorial units from Lancashire with very heavy Northern English accents, and indeed they were mostly staffing the hospital. It wasn't till the middle of 1915 that enough New Zealanders arrived that the New Zealand hospital could actually be properly staffed with New Zealanders. So that's actually quite true. I mean, leaving aside the racist or the odd complaint they have there. Of the total 1,156 New Zealand Expeditionary Force admitted, there have been 8 men and 1 officer died, 3 of which being pneumonia. Mrs. Goodchild, a Cairo lady, has fitted out a motor ambulance at her own expense and taken New Zealand sick to and from this hospital and is available for all urgent calls. All officers and men of the Egyptian army have assisted very greatly in the work, undertaking special services as officer in charge of valuables, electrical engineer, transport, fatigues, dispensing, etc., etc. And of course, I was absolutely delighted, not just a reference to female ambulance drivers, but a specific reference to Mrs. Goodchild. Now, a number of other sources have mentioned that she was driving her ambulance, and I always suspected that it was indeed her own private vehicle, but this is the first one that really spelled it out, that this was definitely a vehicle that belonged to her, and it adds the detail that she'd even paid herself to have it fitted out so it could be used as an ambulance for the troops. And it is, in fact, a Model T Ford. There were slight variations of different Model T Ford types, but I looked very carefully at the wheelbase and everything else and confirmed that it is a Model T Ford. Now, this one here, the story of how enough New Zealanders actually arrived to staff the hospital. And this account comes from the book, who is down there on the bottom left, The War Effort of New Zealand. On April 8, 1915, the first contingent of 50 nurses under the matron-in-chief, Miss McLean, set sail from New Zealand in the steamship Rotorua, now at the bottom of the English Channel. I guess she got torpedoed. A picturesque group they made in their coats of grey and scarlet, so well known as the British Army nurses' uniform, varied somewhat to distinguish their special unit with a silver badge of fern leaf and a red cross to represent New Zealand. On May 17th, this contingent landed in England and proceeded to London, where orders were given them to go on to Egypt to join the New Zealand forces. And this photo in the middle is a photo of that first contingent of New Zealand nurses. Now, when you see it all in black and white, well, it looks all terribly grey. But I found this nice colorized one from that same website that I got that first photo of Nurse Nutsy from. And once you realise that they had this thing over their shoulders that was bright red, it looks considerably more colourful. A busy fortnight ensued in London in procuring field equipment, and again the contingent started off. On June 18th, Alexandria was reached, and now the nurses felt that their long travel was over and that they would be able to commence the work for which they longed. They had heard of the urgent need of help in the hospitals, which were then filling with cases of terrible wounds and the most distressing diseases from Gallipoli. Remember, the Gallipoli landings were on April the 25th, 1915. And they were really much too slow to realize the urgent need they were going to have of more doctors, nurses, and medical facilities in general. And it wasn't, as you can see here, until late June that finally the first contingent of nurses finally arrived in Egypt. The party was warmly welcomed by the matrons of the hospitals in Alexandria, where the shortage of nurses was very great, including at the Egyptian Army Hospital, Abasia, which had been allotted to the New Zealand troops. That's the Pont de Cuba Hospital. It was a surprise to find this hospital run by New Zealanders and staffed by Australian and English sisters, because the sisters had been so long assured that New Zealand nurses were not needed. This hospital was now staffed by the newly arrived New Zealand nurses. Now you're seeing a hint there of something that was going on the home front. The New Zealand government officials at home were very reluctant to let any of these women travel. They didn't want New Zealand nurses, they didn't want New Zealand female doctors, and were saying, oh, no, it's perfectly adequate, we don't need you, blah, 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 blah. When, even someone with half a brain could realize they were urgently needed. And so there was quite a different attitude of the men at the front, and they really knew the help they needed when they were in Egypt. So when January of 1915, Mrs. Goodchild rocked up and says, yes, please, help, great. Well, I think if they'd sought approval from New Zealand, they probably said, oh, no, that's not a good idea. And these nurses faced much the same kind of opposition. But they went anyway. And as it says here, finally in June of 1915, they arrived. They should have been there before the Gallipoli landings. And I found this wonderful photo of the New Zealand nurses from this first contingent arriving in Alexandria. And this is from a photo from the National Army Museum. And I've commented before that sometimes their photo albums, that they've scanned all the photos, they know exactly who took it. Other times they're really rather vague. They'll say photo album of an unknown New Zealand soldier, possibly in the Mounted Rifles or something like this. In this case, at first, it seems very precise. Service number 22/42, Nurse Alice Clara Searell, New Zealand Army Nursing Services Corps. And then it goes on to say, is the possible ID of the owner of the photo album. So they think it could be her photo album, but they can't really prove it. You really wonder sometimes about the story of how they acquired these photo albums and where they'd been and all the backstory. And also I do wonder if, one of these ambulances in the background was somehow driven by Mrs. Goodchild to welcome these New Zealand nurses who had finally arrived and who were so badly needed. And here's a later photo. This one, at least we know whose photo album it was. Photograph album collated by 22/74 Sister Mary Eleanor Gould, New Zealand Army Nursing Service Corps. Although I also wonder about that word collated. Does that mean she didn't take all the photos, but she collected a bunch of other people's photos and put them together? Again, not sure. Now this ambulance looks quite distinctly different from the one that Mrs. Goodchild was driving. It's got a much longer wheelbase, for example, and I suspect that the New Zealander who's sitting down was probably the driver. And I've shown you already this photo, which was my first discovery anywhere of a picture of Mrs. Goodchild. And I mentioned in the first episode about my discovery story that Ray Foster, who was the, a half great nephew, I think is how you describe the relationship to Valerie Goodchild, had never seen a photo of this elusive and mysterious family member who'd went off to Egypt, and I was able to send him a copy of this. And this was the first one I found, Scenes in the Anteroom to the Dardanelles. And if you see this one at the bottom, it's got quite an interesting caption, all those boys in the hospital. The long room echoes with laughter and merry talk, and it is hard to realize that one is in the presence of so much suffering, in the presence of men who have risked their all for an ideal, who have looked terrible death full in the face in Gallipoli. This photograph is a happy impression of a ward at Luna Park Hospital, Cairo. The beds are made from date stalks and palm leaves. And yeah, it's got a bit of the rah rah propaganda, but it's also got the acknowledgement of just how brutal and awful the experience of these men. And of course, Red Cross cars at Cairo, waiting the arrival of the hospital trains from the Dardanelles. So the hospital ships would have landed at Alexandria or Port Said, and then they would have been put on hospital ships. And when those ambulance trains, as they were called, arrived, well, you'd have a whole pile of ambulance drivers waiting to pick up the men and distribute them to the various different hospitals. And again, the lady in the photograph, there's my Valerie Goodchild, who drives her own motor ambulance. And I've shown you these photos before, so I won't make fresh comment on them, but, well, there's a bunch of ones, all of which I've managed to confirm are indeed Valerie Goodchild. I really wish there was a clearer photo of her face. I think the one on the top right there is probably the best image I've ever found, but they're always very grainy, and I'm not really sure that I would recognize her if well, I mean, if she could get in a time machine and walk down the street, I don't think I would recognize her from any of these photos. And this photo on the bottom left, I haven't commented on before, but there's a whole line of ambulance drivers, and there's only one woman driver, and that, I'm positive, is Valerie Goodchild. Now, that photo from the bottom left, well, if you remember in the previous episode, I talked about this photo on the top right, that helped me discover the photo on the top left because they were just in a box of loose photos at the National Library of New Zealand, and a very helpful librarian, when I gave her the collection number of the top right photo, looked through the box and found me that photo on the top left. And the story of the woman who took those photos is very interesting. That led me to do the same thing with the photo on the bottom left. And that photo album, we can see there's a much less clear impression of the same photo in the blue circle. Well, this photo album belonged to Agnes Peggy Williams. And she was one of that first contingent of nurses who left New Zealand in April of 1915. And, if you know anything about World War I, being mentioned in dispatches by the general is kind of an honor. And so she was mentioned in dispatches by General Maxwell in March of 1916. And along with many of the other doctors and staff, and ultimately Valerie Goodchild herself, when the New Zealanders relocated a lot of their people from Egypt into Europe, a lot of the staff went to Brockenhurst Hospital in England, and she was part of this contingent who went to England when all the New Zealand boys went to France. And she got married in 1917, and in May was discharged from the New Zealand Expeditionary Force at her own request. I guess the rules that applied to women were a little different. Men didn't get discharged from the army just because they got married, but I guess the military authorities had a different view of how things worked. And you can see the photo on the bottom right, again, very, very overexposed. But if you've been looking at the other photos, you'll know that is the Pont de Cuba Hospital with the tent in front. And I'm pretty sure from context that this photo on the bottom left with all those extra tents is also the Pont de Cuba, which just shows how overwhelmed they were, and they just did not have room in the facilities to house all the wounded men, and had to put up a whole bunch of tents for further wounded men in the grounds, which makes, again from context, the photo in the top right probably the view from the upstairs window of that hospital looking out over that same group of tents. Now there she is. What was her name again? Agnes Williams, Peggy Williams. And you can see there's a number of other photos there. So the one on the top right, there's some ambulances, and again, very overexposed. But I really wonder, is perhaps Valerie Goodchild in that photo somewhere? Down in the bottom right. Well, a little bit easier to see and doesn't look like there is anybody wearing a dress or a skirt. They all seem to be men, but again, at the same hospital. And another view, but certainly it gives you a very good impression of the location where Valerie Goodchild would have been driving her ambulance, where they would have been carrying the boys, and, well, all the rest. And, well, there were quite a lot of photos from her photo album, so you can imagine I enjoyed looking through them all. And again, looking at all these different shots of New Zealand boys and wounded troopers being dropped off at the hospital, or sometimes perhaps when they're now a little bit better but not yet fit, they're being put into the ambulances and taken to the convalescent hospitals to rest up and be ready to go back. Or in the most severe cases, they would have been taking them to ships and they would have been sent home to New Zealand as medically unfit. And this is perhaps the best photo that I found, this great posed photo of all these New Zealand ambulance drivers and all the staff associated posing in this gate in Cairo somewhere. And I've looked long and hard for a female anywhere in the shot, and I can't find one. Now, that might just be coincidence. Maybe Mrs. Goodchild was busy or something, but I've already made reference to the reluctance of the Home authorities to take female help in the war effort at this point. So I wouldn't be surprised if somebody had actually said, well, since this might end up in the newspapers and things like this, it might just be better if we didn't rub it in their noses. Perhaps you stay out of the photo. I'm speculating, but I wouldn't be surprised. Now, here's a handsome fellow, George William Thompson, and he was in the same unit as my grandfather, the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance. He was a dentist. Yes, it was a mobile field hospital, but the mobile field hospital didn't just have, surgeons and those kind of things. They also went equipped with dentists. And he had a photo album, and I'm going to come back and make reference to some of the things in his photo album in other episodes. And I scoured his photo album looking for my grandfather anywhere. There's one or two shots that you can see some drivers on the wagons that could, in theory, be my grandfather, but there were no shots clearly identifiable and provable to be my grandfather. But at the same time, there were only a few hundred men between the doctors and the male nurses and the drivers and all the rest. So it wasn't as if they were a large unit consisting of thousands of men. And so all of the people and places that feature in his photography must have been closely associated with my grandfather. And this photo that I featured at the opening is a photo described in the caption as Mrs. Goodchild in her ambulance. And I'm pretty sure that's an unusual shot of the Pont de Cuba Hospital. You can see it's actually got sort of a quad in the middle. The other photos make it look like it's just a rectangular building. And I've never seen any other shots of it, but it does seem to match the Pont de Cuba Hospital. And this is the other photo that's in the photo album. Now, one of the things you can see here is the stretchers that are over the top of the roof. Now, because this was not built as a cargo van or any kind of purpose-built ambulance, you can see it's actually too short for somebody to lie down in, so it would have only really been suitable for transporting wounded men who were capable of sitting up. And just by way of example, here's a different shot of a New Zealand ambulance that has a much longer wheelbase. If you look carefully, well, I'll use the mouse here on the screen, you can see the difference between the spare wheel and that wheel. You can see there's this big box between that, and then you see that here's the spare wheel and the rear wheel. You can see it's a much narrower space. So this one would have been long enough for men to lie down, maybe very snug, but it could have taken wounded men who couldn't sit up. On the other hand, this ambulance at the front, well, its covering at the back is a bit different from Goodchild's, but I've seen at least one photo of her where she's driving a different vehicle, and it doesn't mean this part couldn't have been changed. I strongly suspect they would have liked to have had New Zealand written on it. And because this one has a much shorter wheelbase, which really isn't very suitable for ambulances, I do wonder if this one at the front could actually be Valerie Goodchild's own vehicle that she had altered at her own expense for helping the New Zealanders. And then we have this one I've shown you before from the Make Her Praises Heard Afar. And again, this one, there she is again, having a good time, hanging around with a couple of New Zealand doctors, and Agnes Bennett, another one of these famous strong-willed women who went out from New Zealand. If you recall her story, she offered to both the New Zealand and Australian armies to, give her help as a trained doctor, and they said, no, thank you, we don't need your help. And she said, well, I'm not going to take no for an answer, bought passage to England on a passenger ship and decided she was going to go out and help anyway. And when she got to Egypt and saw how overwhelmed they were with all the wounded flooding back from Gallipoli, she changed her plans and said, well, this is where I'm going to stay. And there's Mrs. Goodchild featuring in one of Agnes Bennett's photos. And I've scoured newspaper records, and of course I found a number from New Zealand, but this one I actually found from Trove, which is the website where you can go to search Australian newspapers. And I have to say, I was very happy to find yet another photo of Valerie Goodchild, despite it being a truly, truly awful one. I'm sure this would be one of those photos that if she saw it, she would have gone, oh dear, why did they use that photo? It's just not the most flattering photo you've ever seen. And you see it here, she's described as a lady chauffeur. Mrs. Goodchild of Cairo, whose services as a voluntary Red Cross chauffeur to the Australians and the New Zealanders in Egypt have been greatly appreciated by the authorities. Now, what's interesting here is this is the only reference I have seen anywhere to her ever doing anything for the Australians. She was clearly very loyal and attached to the New Zealanders, and I've seen no other references in any record to having anything else to do with the Australians. But if you know how trans-Tasman rivalry works, there's always a case where the Australians want to lay claim to anything good that the New Zealanders produce. So here's, the Australians, the Australian Imperial Force, somewhere in France, with the Australian flag, to the last man, to the last shilling, greater love hath no man than a man lay down his life for his friends. I've noticed when they talk about the ANZACs, ANZAC, which stands for the Australian New Zealand Army Corps, when Australians talk about the ANZACs, they often even seem to forget what the NZ stands for, and they just talk solely about the Australian contributions. And the New Zealanders always get mightily annoyed by this. And, well, Russell Crowe, a New Zealander, he always gets claimed by the Australians. And there was Crowded House, another band where the lead singer was formerly of Split Enz, a major New Zealand band, but they'd always claimed that as an Australian band, and so on and so on. But Valerie Goodchild's contribution was almost exclusively for the New Zealanders. And as you'll see later in this story, she was very much attached to the New Zealanders. Now, just to help you out, if you're not an Australian or New Zealander, it's easy to mistake the Australian and New Zealand flags. You can see over on the left there's the Australian flag, and in the middle there is the New Zealand flag. The thing to look for are the stars. The Australian flag has one more star, and it has this over-large white one under the British Union Jack. The other thing to look for is the colour of the stars. The Australian stars are pure white. The New Zealand stars have a white outline, but they are red in the middle. And that's actually my father and my two kids when they were much younger than they are now, that are standing by that New Zealand flagpole. Now, I've quoted several times before Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ernest Thomas. He was the commanding officer of the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance, who was in charge of the force with my grandfather, and how he died tragically at Gallipoli. And I also made comment about how a collection of his letters had been recently donated to a museum and scanned and uploaded, which proved to be an invaluable source for me. And in one of his letters, I was truly delighted to find a passing reference to Mrs. Goodchild. And this is a letter he was writing home to his wife. Mrs. Goodchild, who drives the motor ambulance of her own, has measles. I understand she's been transporting measles to the measles camp against my instructions. If so, she has only herself to blame. Written from Zaytoun Camp, April 15th, 1915. This is only 10 days before the landings at Gallipoli, although the New Zealand Mounted Field Ambulance will not be sent to Gallipoli until May, but still very, very late in the day before the Gallipoli campaign was due to kick off. And also interesting there, you can see two things. Well, you can see she was continuing to work with the New Zealanders in April, but also you can see something of her personality, very strong-willed, and even when given an instruction, don't you go doing this, she says, oh, it'll be fine, I'm going to do it anyway, I don't have to listen to silly instructions, they don't apply to me. And Colonel Thomas was obviously not amused by this. Now, most of the rest of the story comes from her New Zealand Army file that I got from Archway, the New Zealand government records. In previous episodes, I've talked a lot about what you can find in these military files, and there's nothing in there that really reveals that she wasn't a New Zealander. Like that book, Make Her Praises Heard Afar, that has a photo of her and makes passing reference of her, clearly assumes that she's a New Zealander and didn't realize there was so much more to her story. So this letter that was written in June of 1928 from the New Zealand government offices in London to the New Zealand Expeditionary Force Base Records office in New Zealand was basically saying, can you make sure that she is properly credited with her military service? And there are various medals for war service that she's entitled to. And this is basically by way of proof of what her service was, so they can work out which medals she was entitled to. And I'll be quoting from this letter a number of times, which helps me fill out her story. And this is something that was in the letter. She served in Egypt all through the Gallipoli Campaign and was sent to England on the troop ship which conveyed the men of the New Zealand motor transport in August of 1916. Now, I've tried to work out which ship carried them, and there was a previous episode when I talked about how the New Zealanders transferred from Egypt to Marseille in France, and there was the war diary of the base commandant in Marseille. But sadly, the records in August get a lot thinner with a lot less detail. It was very apparent, sort of June, July, that there were a lot of vehicles and motorbikes and ambulances and bicycles and all sorts of things that were being transported, following up from all of the men. So they sent the troops first. First it was the Australians, then the New Zealanders, and then the South Africans, and after that followed the vehicles. So I assume that she probably came via Marseille, but I was not able to identify the ship. This photo below, sort of, I borrowed it because it had some trucks in the foreground, and I could imagine that it looked like it was transporting men and vehicles from Egypt, but it's actually a World War II photo and is taken completely out of context, but at least it illustrates the kind of thing that it must have looked like. Now, her first place, as I've already mentioned in passing, was at Brockenhurst in England. And the letter continues, August 1916, reported for duty at the New Zealand Hospital, Brockenhurst, immediately on her arrival and remained there until November of the same year. So you can see that Brockenhurst is down there, not far from the Isle of Wight, quite close to the coast, and they did indeed sometimes take New Zealand wounded down to the coast to, give them a bit of break, and also not far from Christchurch, from which there is a major city in the South Island of New Zealand, named after that Christchurch. And here's some photos from Brockenhurst. Sadly, no female ambulance drivers in sight, but you can see the wounded guy on his crutches. You can see some nurses there, and you can fill it in and imagine that those capes they're wearing are in fact in scarlet, and plenty of ambulances, one of which could very well have been driven by Valerie Goodchild. And other things about Brockenhurst. 29th of August 1916. Goodchild enrolled as Chafoose in Brockenhurst in the 198 detachment of the Voluntary Aid Detachment. They were called VADs. Basically, you had female nurses who had the status of being nurses, but what about the various other females who volunteered and were doing various other jobs? Well, they formed a military organization called the Voluntary Aid Detachment, and so these women were just called VADs, members of the VAD. And it's interesting that she was only enrolling as a VAD once she got to England, which makes me wonder if she had never actually had any official status or title. She was just a person who rocked up to help out, which would probably fit with the more casual nature of how New Zealand colonials were likely to treat things, as opposed to the formality when she got to England, saying, well, you have to have some status, like, what are you? Who are you? What's your official title and job here? So she only becomes a VAD once she gets to England in August of 1916. And you can see there's a guy repairing one of the engines on an ambulance at Brockenhurst at the top, and again another shot from Brockenhurst showing them loading or unloading some patients. And there actually is her the official evidence that she was now a VAD. She was a section leader. She wasn't just a general helper. Section leader Mrs. Elwyn Valerie Goodchild. Well, we know that her legal name was Elsie Elwyn Valerie, and you can see there she clearly didn't like the name Elsie. It's not even featuring in the record. And this particular record has her there from, as a section leader at least, from January of 1917 to July of 1917. And, well, yet more images. I had a lot of fun going through finding images to illustrate this and what it would have been like, what it was like for the ambulance drivers and all the men loading and unloading. You can see they even managed to get a double layer of wounded. There's an upper shelf for them. And another newspaper to give you some context of what life was like for the wounded at Brockenhurst. This is the Ashburton Guardian, a South Island newspaper, July 10th, 1916, for the soldiers. Now that so many New Zealand soldiers are in France and England, many people have been inquiring as to what is the best course to adopt when sending money for the benefit of the men. Monies should be sent to the New Zealand War Contingent Association in London and can be sent through the Minister of Internal Affairs or through any bank. The High Commissioner is chairman of the association and Lord Plunkett is chairman of the executive. Many well-known New Zealanders are giving their whole time to look after the affairs of the association. Lord Plunkett, in cabling to a member of the Wellington War Relief Association, pointed out that their visitors are regularly visiting and providing minor comforts for the men in the hospitals at Walton and Brockenhurst and all other hospitals and homes where New Zealand men are. Lord Plunkett had been governor of New Zealand, and his wife was quite involved with setting up nursing services. And so the Plunkett services, which were kind of like a service to help young mothers with new children, was quite a common thing in New Zealand. Plunkett nurses and Plunkett books. And I still have my old Plunkett book, which was like basically a vaccination record and some advice of how to treat new babies from when I was a small child. Carrying on. He stated that the association is starting recreation rooms staffed by New Zealanders at Brockenhurst and Salisbury. They also have a nurses' rest home at Sandwich, and a London hostel is nearly finished. Further special care and attention are now being given to men of furlough from France. The association is also spending money for Red Cross purposes on behalf of the men and providing comforts for men in the firing line or at the front. It will be seen, therefore, that it will be necessary for New Zealanders to keep this association well supplied with monies in order that it may carry out the good work which it is doing. Now, the photo on the bottom right is not for wounded men. It's, I believe, actually a YMCA recreation room, but again, you get the general idea that they can go and play pools or billiards or whatever. Now, the one at the top right is definitely involving wounded men. Now, you might say, well, of course they're wounded men. You can see the casts on their damaged arms. But actually, the thing I want you to pay attention to here is that the uniforms are different. The hats might be the same, but you can see that there's a different kind of collar on them versus the ones at the bottom. Now, these men are in, battle khakis, the kind of thing that men would fight in on the bottom right. On the top right, they are in what was called the hospital blues. Wounded men at these hospitals were actually given a distinct and very different uniform. And apparently, all the men absolutely hated them. They really, really hated to be forced to wear these hospital blues. But it was done to distinguish them from, fit soldiers. I'm not really quite sure of the reasoning, but it did mean if a wounded soldier went wandering off, everybody would know just by looking at the clothes he was wearing that he was supposed to be in one of the hospitals. Now, another story here. Evening Post, September 21st, 1916. In a big hospital, work among the wounded. Some very interesting letters and photographs have been received lately from Miss Christine Smith, who is a masseuse at the New Zealand General Hospital at Brockenhurst. Miss Smith is on duty for 12 hours every day, and sometimes longer when there are urgent cases. The New Forest is close by, and the nurses attached to the hospital have some delightful walks there, and the New Zealanders fully appreciate the glorious trees and wildflowers, as well as the good roads in every direction. Miss Smith remarks that they are enduring the daylight saving regulation, and between that and the late English twilight, it never seems to be really dark. Yep, daylight saving was a new thing and a lot of people didn't like it. And the other thing is, people often don't realize just how far north England is. The days are very short in winter and very long in the summer. And really, it doesn't get properly dark till after 11 p.m. The wonderful courage and endurance of the soldier patients fill all the nurses with admiration, and one lad, who had been badly damaged about the head, thigh, and foot, said how lucky he had been, as his eyes were spared undamaged. Almost without exception, they find something to be thankful for. The Mrs. Agnes Pearce and Bell are driving motors in connection with hospitals and doing splendid work. Apparently their hours on duty are very considerable, as they may be called out at any time, early or late. Now, what you've got to remember about these letters home that get published in the newspapers, there's always going to be a significant delay of, maybe a couple of months. Now, Valerie Goodchild arrived in August. This is appearing in September. So my guess is that this account was sent before Valerie Goodchild had actually arrived and started work. So I can bet that Agnes Pearce and this Miss Bell would have been very grateful for another female ambulance driver to turn up and lighten the load and help them out. Now, these photos come from the photo collection of Deborah Pitts-Taylor, who I mentioned in episode 1, and here's the entrance for the New Zealand General Hospital number 1, which is interesting because the Pontecuba Hospital in Egypt was also called the New Zealand General Hospital number 1, but different location, and obviously now most of the staff have been relocated here. And again, it often comes as a surprise to people to realize that the New Zealanders had all of their own facilities. They had their own training camps, they had their own hospitals, they had their own convalescent camps, entirely separate from the British Army. And by all accounts, and certainly the accounts of the New Zealanders, they all wanted to be in the New Zealand places. They didn't think that they were treated nearly as well or that the conditions were nearly as good for the English troops and the English facilities. They all felt that the New Zealand camps and New Zealand facilities were far superior. And there's Mrs. Goodchild. I've shown you that photo before. But the reason I particularly bring this one up on this slide is because this other person who's in the photo is actually this Agnes Pearce, who gets mentioned in this newspaper story. At Brockenhurst, they are well supplied with newspapers. They get the dailies regularly, and each mail brings sackloads of New Zealand papers for the staff and the patients. Supplies of all sorts, cakes, sweets, soap, cigarettes, and other things are easily procurable, and in great contrast to the difficulties experienced in obtaining them in Egypt. Many of the boys who had been on Gallipoli say that in all they preferred that to the fighting in France, the noise and confusion being terrible, and they were very, very tired of bully beef and Shanghai ballast, which was rice. No, that's really an interesting comment, because the way we're always taught about Gallipoli and everything else in New Zealand schools and all the books you tend to read was Gallipoli was hell on earth. You couldn't imagine anything worse. Those incompetent British sent our boys to die on the beaches and on the cliffs, and it was just the worst thing that was possibly imaginable. So it's actually quite fascinating to see this passing comment. What is it? The boys who have been on Gallipoli say they preferred that to the fighting in France. Well, I mean, nobody thinks that the fighting in France was nice, but interesting. If given a choice, where would you rather be, the trenches in France or the hellhole of Gallipoli? Well, on balance, I think Gallipoli was better. That I found an absolutely fascinating and surprising comment, and also the fact that they thought they were fed a lot better when they were down there. And it is one of the constant gripes of all the troops that the food that they sent the soldiers in the front lines in France was truly awful. A lot of bully beef, which is this canned meat, which was usually gristle, and there was a lot of war profiteering. But I'd never heard this slang term before, Shanghai ballast, which is apparently a name for rice. Perhaps in future, when I serve rice to my family, I should call it, well, here's some Shanghai ballast for you. Anyway, carrying on. Letters such as those written by Miss Smith, without any idea of publication, make quite a picture in words of the cheerfulness and courage of both soldiers, nurses, and voluntary helpers in sad and trying situations. Beg your pardon, in sad and trying situations. And that is one of the reasons why I absolutely love trawling through this website, Past Papers New Zealand, because so much of the information you get isn't proper newspaper stories written by journalists. people were writing letters home from, their troop ships, or from when they're on leave, or nurses were writing home. And then frequently the people who got these private letters, private correspondence, would then take it to the newspaper and say, do you want to publish this? So you get this constant flood of primary personal takes about what was going on. It was the hunger of the New Zealand public to understand and see what was happening that the newspapers thought that it was well worth publishing these private little accounts of all these interesting little details. Now, I tried to find some more information about this Christine Smith. Well, Smith is not the easiest name to look up, but I did manage to identify her. Different locations call her either Christine or Christina, but they all agree that she was Christine Mary Louise Smith. Sadly, I could not find a photo of her, and I did pull her military file, and, well, it just had the typical normal boring stuff, but a couple of interesting things I noted. She was 30 at age of enlistment, so she would have been older than many of the women who went out. She was 5 foot 9.5 inches, which was really tall for the time. Like, my grandfather was 5 foot 6, and he was average height. So she would have been considered a particularly tall woman. And given her job as a masseuse, this is giving massages to wounded men to help them with their recovery. It's not like just for relaxation purposes. So I guess you'd expect she was quite a large woman who, was strong and muscular, what you'd expect from somebody who was a professional masseuse. And the other interesting detail, I noted that she married in 1927 when she was 47 years of age, which again was, well, there must have been an interesting story there, not a normal thing in its day. Now, Agnes Pearce, I managed to find a few more photos of her in the photo album of Deborah Pitts-Taylor. Deborah Pitts-Taylor is the one in the front left of this particular photo album, and there's Agnes Pearce at the back right. And also there's Agnes Pearce down there, fixing up the ambulance, dealing with some issue with the oil or something or other mechanically involved. And as I was looking her up, I actually found at the National Library a whole bunch of love letters that were written from her husband-to-be in England that, for one reason or another, have been scanned and made publicly available and are considered to be of historical importance, that the National Library of New Zealand has preserved them all. And I felt, I have to say, a little bit like a peeping Tom, but here's a sample of it, which I thought was quite delightful. Letters to Agnes Pearce. Dear Pickle, I was greeted by your 2 letters this morning, and they made up a little for your absence, which is saying a good deal. It was a delightful sensation to get the first 2 letters from you, and it made me realize more than ever what a lucky old dog I am. Your life in Brockenhurst now must be a strange contrast to what we must call now the olden days, and so on, and so on. I mean, I'm sure there's some interesting historical details, but the letters to my dear Pickle, yes, that was his pet name for his fiancée. And, well, let me say, she did marry well, because Agnes Pearce was to become later Lady Agnes Stout, because Duncan Stout, who was calling her Pickle and writing these letters to her, was the son of the New Zealand Premier Robert Stout, and had quite a distinguished career himself. He was the author of the official history in 3 volumes of the New Zealand Medical Corps in World War II, their service in, against the Japanese, their service in the Middle East and Europe and all of the rest. There's the front cover of one of his books. He was also Chancellor of Victoria University, Wellington, and I sometimes quote from Victoria University's collection of scanned World War I official histories, and I wonder if it's because of him that's why they have such a good collection of all the official military histories. And he got a lot of awards from the Queen, a DSO, an OBE, and a CBE. And it's only the higher level honours from the Queen that entitle you to be called Sir. So he was Sir Duncan Stout, and as a result, Agnes Pearce, now Agnes Stout, got to be known as Lady Agnes Stout. Now, Agnes herself actually was honoured by the Queen. She was awarded an MBE. An MBE is the lowest level of the honours given by the Queen, and if a man gets it, he's not entitled to call himself Sir, and a woman is not entitled to call herself Lady. In fact, the higher order ones, the women get to call themselves Dame. but because she was married to Duncan Stout, who had an OBE and a CBE, um, he was entitled to call himself Sir Duncan Stout, and she was Lady Stout, better known as Pickle. And another newspaper story here. March 13th, 1917, hands across the sea. Many nice things have been said about New Zealand soldiers, but the following tribute, contained in a letter received by the last mail from the minister in the county of Hants, England, is so nice that a short extract may interest our readers. The Reverend and Mrs. Lamb write, "We are very much in touch with New Zealand just now, as the base hospital for your country is at Brockenhurst, only 4.5 miles from us. All the staff, nurses, orderlies, etc., are from New Zealand. We have several of the men here to tea now and again, and we take some of the worst cases out for drives in our car. Such delightful men they mostly are, so intelligent and entertaining, and so thoroughly kindly polite, and yet self-respecting too. We see some fine specimens of manhood, but it is grievous to see them often sorely crippled. If you have any relations or friends serving in France, let them know our address, and tell them if ever they be sent to Brockenhurst to let us know they're there." And it's actually quite wonderful to see that there were all these civilians in New Zealand donating money to for the care of the wounded in England, and there were all these civilians in England who really just wanted to help out. But also you can see here something of the positive impression that the New Zealanders made, and I suspect this is part and parcel of why Valerie Goodchild always wanted to stick close with the New Zealanders. I think she probably liked us. Let's put it that way. And this photo at the top, Milford-on-Sea. Well, this is some kind of driver, you can see her on the bottom right, who's taken these wounded men, you see them all in their hospital blues, down to the coast. And I had a look, and it's like a 20-minute drive from Brockenhurst down to Milford-on-Sea. So definitely these men would have been wounded soldiers from Brockenhurst, and some civilian, perhaps like Reverend and Mrs. Lamb, or perhaps even Mrs. Goodchild, had sort of driven them down to the coast to get a bit of fresh air and have an outing and get them out of the hospital. And here's another shot from Deborah Pitts-Taylor of what was going on at Brockenhurst with the loading and unloading of wounded men. And another photo here of all of the ambulance drivers. Now, sadly, for my purpose at least, Valerie Goodchild's not in the shot. But again, you get an idea of the kind of ambulances they were driving and the kind of uniform they wear, and just what the general environment was like. Back to that letter from 1928. In November of 1916, Goodchild was transferred to the New Zealand General Hospital at Walton-on-Thames. So she went from Brockenhurst up to Walton-on-Thames. So number 1, New Zealand General Hospital, to number 2, New Zealand General Hospital. And here's some shots from Walton-on-Thames. And another newspaper story to tell you what that was like, from the Waikato Times, March 1917. Mr. James Henry, formerly a staff member of this newspaper, the Waikato Times, who was sick some weeks ago and has been transferred to Walton-on-Thames, says, "We're living like kings and nothing to do. There are about 1,200 New Zealanders here. My word, they gave us all a good time at Christmas. We got all sorts of presents and as much fruit and cake as we could eat. What a comfort to the anxious ones at home to know their loved ones are not neglected, but cared for as if they were in our own midst." And I particularly like this story from the Taranaki Herald, February 1917. "By the last mail, a letter was received from Mrs. Claude Weston, London, in which she says, 'It was a great day at Walton-on-Thames. Each ward had been turned into a bower. The men had been working for a week beforehand. There was a competition for the prettiest and best decorated ward. The High Commissioner sent each man a diary. The War Contingent Association gave each man a pocketbook, fountain pen or purse, and the hospital gave them things too. Then they had a concert in the hall in the evening. It's not a boast, but no men are so well looked after by their people as the New Zealand men are. Nothing can make up for what they have done. For them, it is something to feel that it is so appreciated by us, and that the men's welfare is of the first importance. Sometimes one feels that sentiment has too big a place, that too much goes in entertaining the wounded, whereas all the energy should go into the making of munitions and the keeping of our trade together. But one begins to see that this sentiment is the cement of the whole thing. I don't think the men will mind so much what they have sacrificed if we never forget the gratitude we owe them, and if we keep on helping them through. I think that is what the New Zealanders are doing. You are giving so abundantly, and over here the money is going into the right channels. It's again, when you hear about World War One, all you imagine is the trenches and the blood and the guts, and it's quite heartwarming to get some sort of story about how these men were being treated and how so many people were doing so much to try to make them feel at least some measure of comfort, even while they were trying to recover from brutal wounds. And the account from that 1928 letter continues. In January of 1917, she went to France with the British Red Cross, where she understood she'd be allowed to work for the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, but Colonel Park's application for her was refused. She thereupon resigned from the British Red Cross Society and returned to England. And these photos do show ambulance drivers. I think actually the one on the top left are Canadian female ambulance drivers. There were by now quite a number of female ambulance drivers, but I do wonder if Mrs. Goodchild was actually the very first. January of 1915, I don't think any other countries had any female ambulance drivers at that point. And these are British woman ambulance drivers that could, in theory, include Mrs. Goodchild as one of the people in that shot. They were certainly in France in the right time and place when this photo was taken. And as a New Zealander, well, what can I say? It gives you a sense of pride that I want to work for the New Zealanders. If I can't work for the New Zealanders, well, screw you. I quit. I'm going back to England, where I'm going to go back to the New Zealanders. Thank you very much. The New Zealanders or nothing. And I found this photo. It's from a sergeant in the field ambulance in Egypt. Nothing out of context, but doesn't he look very proud of himself? So that was just my thought of this very proud New Zealander standing there. Yes, she couldn't work with us. She didn't want to work with anybody. Yes, very proud. Now, I did mention that Deborah Pitts Taylor had an address book, and it gave an address for where Mrs. Goodchild was located in France at Hotel des Anglais La Tonquette, France. And I looked up to find out where it was. I even managed to find a photo of it. There it is. No healthier place can be imagined. Hotel des Anglais, La Tonquette, Etaples. Now, again, I'll borrow the mouse and make it move around here. You can see there's La Tonquette, there's Dover and Folkestone, there's Calais and Dunkirk, and Ypres, Arras. These are names that feature heavily in World War I history. And it doesn't show it on the map, but just to the right of La Tonquette was Etaples, which was one of the major New Zealand base. And you can see here, there's some photos of it. This is a bunch of New Zealand soldiers at Etaples getting their mail from home. And you can see one of them pulled out the newspaper. Remember the comment in one of the previous slides about how the New Zealand men would devour the newspapers. And so this is where she was located. And I found this wonderful photo in the Imperial War Museum showing a bunch of female ambulance drivers from June of 1917. So she was still there. She hadn't quit yet. She didn't go back till July. And what the caption said is that an ambulance train carrying a bunch of wounded men had arrived, and they were all running to their ambulances to get moving and get to the train station and pick up all the wounded men and bring them to the hospital. And again, can't help looking at these and wondering if one of these figures is Mrs. Goodchild, and she could very well be in this photo for all we know. And then this letter from 1928 continues. She returned to England, rejoining the New Zealand Motor Transport at Oatlands Park, Weybridge, in July of 1917, after an absence of 6 months. And for nearly a year she served in the workshops and did all the tyre repairing for that section. So she wasn't just an ambulance driver, she was a motor mechanic capable of keeping the vehicles on the road. Now, this is a point that I thought immediately when I first saw that you had a woman driving a car in Egypt in January of 1915. You have to realize that to own a car back then was a much more complicated affair now. Generally, you can know nothing about mechanical matters. Today, just buy a car and drive it around, and if it breaks down, very occasionally we'll, get a repairman to fix it. The machines they were using in 1915 were not like that at all. Even the gearing was enormously more complicated. Like people think it's all you've got is your automatic versus your manual or stick shift, but actually even adjusting the gears was very much more complicated. So learning to drive was significantly more difficult than it is today. And if you couldn't keep it maintained and be able to do on the spot basic repairs, you couldn't be driving a vehicle around. It just wouldn't be doable. You had to know how to change tires. You had to know, basic maintenance and oil changes and all of the rest. Otherwise, it wasn't going to happen. So when Mrs. Goodchild is driving her own motor vehicle, that instantly implies in 1915 that she is an amateur mechanic. She's not just some woman who drives a car. She has a set of skills that makes her capable of maintaining and driving a complicated and not altogether reliable machine. And these are various shots of people changing tires. New Zealanders, well, this is not New Zealanders, but guys in Egypt on the top right. These are some New Zealanders in England changing a tire, and I already used this photo in the middle from Brockenhurst working on the engine, and just a line of ambulances. Now, the Otago Daily Times, March 3rd, 1918. Mrs. Elwyn Valerie Goodchild, VAD, New Zealand Expeditionary Force, recently appointed member of the British Empire Order, works with the New Zealand Mechanical Transport. Recently, she was promoted to the rank of charge driver and is now instructing in tyre and tube repairs, HF vulcanizing process, in the School of Motoring for Limbless Soldiers. And these photos are from there, and they are from these various training facilities. You can see these guys are learning basic office work, and if you look carefully, you can see that they don't have arms. The fellow over on the right has lost his right arm. The next fellow in, the sergeant, doesn't have a left arm. They've been crippled in various degrees. This guy here, he's lost his left arm, and actually I've seen close-up photos of him. He's only got a thumb and one finger on his right hand. He had been very badly mangled, and there they are learning basic, skills that they can apply in after they're out of the army and to earn some money. And these guys are actually learning a really important skill, because New Zealand is famous for its sheep, and they're learning the skill of sorting and grading the wool that's been shed. And you can, again, I don't know if you look closely at this guy here, you can actually see he's got no feet. He's got these sort of stilt things attached to stumps because he had lost both his feet. This guy's missing a leg, and they had entered into a lot of training facilities. And apparently, Mrs. Goodchild was training some of them in the motor mechanic workshop. Now, and this photo here, this is they're learning woodworking skills. Again, you see this fellow's lost his left arm, and they're basically doing wood shop and learning some critical skills for doing woodworking. Now, as I said, I always like to try and check my sources. Here we have one comment in one newspaper story that Mrs. Goodchild was involved in training limbless New Zealanders in changing car tyres. And some of the information that comes from the New Zealand archives, like the New Zealand military files, has all been scanned and is freely available. But there's an enormous number of other documents at the New Zealand Government Archives in Wellington that has never been scanned. And the only way you can get them, is to pay a very large fee for one of the staff to locate it and scan it for you, or to go there yourself. In my case, I'm lucky enough to have an elder brother who lives in Wellington, and I was able to persuade him to go there, and I gave him a list of documents to take digital photos of and send them to me. And I particularly wanted to get all of the documents that were associated with the training of disabled soldiers. And he got me a whole pile of really interesting documents. I may well make a whole episode about that later. But this document has some critical information on it. Here we go. Training of disabled soldiers. Excellent work continues to be carried out by our limbless soldiers under Captain Richards, New Zealand Army Service Corps Motor Transport. The following numbers are at present undergoing training, and all the men are now keen to learn some trade. Another hut has been erected to provide additional accommodation for wool classing and boot making. All the pupils are limbless soldiers awaiting fitting of artificial limbs. I'm able to get limbless men trained, but cannot undertake to deal with orthopedic patients, as they're so numerous and will have to be dealt with on return to the Dominion. The Dominion in this case means New Zealand. The numbers now undergoing training in England is motor engineering 13, watchmaking 1, electrical engineering 3, clerical course, architecture, artificial limb making, poultry farming, forget what that other one is, motor engineering at Oatlands Park under Captain Richards, chemistry, tailoring, dental, bootmaking, wireless telegraphy, civil engineering, law studies, commercial courses at Oatlands Park Hospital under Sergeant Johnson, and woodwork. Now you see quite a lot of commercial courses, 30 men doing that, 12 men doing woodworking, 13 doing motor engineering. Now, motor engineering at Oatlands Park under Captain Richards, 25 men. That's where Valerie Goodchild is supposed to be involved. And I really hunted high and low to find any mention of her being involved in any of this, and I never did find her name. Does that mean she wasn't doing it? No, I wouldn't go that far. She certainly wasn't in charge of it, and I guess they weren't going to mention everybody who helped out. But it was, well, at least I would have liked to have had confirmation from these primary sources from the New Zealand archives concerning this venture. But again, rather nice to know that they were doing all of this stuff to try to help these men rehabilitate. Again, I think people often have the idea in World War One they didn't care. The men got wounded, they got patched up and sent home to do whatever. Who cares? We don't mind. We don't care about you anymore. But that really wasn't the case. Now, I did manage to identify the Captain Richards. He's the fellow on the right. Actually, I can't help being intrigued by the expression on his face in that photo, wondering what he's thinking and why he looks like he's got such a strange expression on his face. Did he not like the fellow on his right? I'm not sure. He was with the New Zealand Motor Transport, which was where we know that Valerie Goodchild was, and I was able to pinpoint that he was in Egypt until August of 1916. So his time there would have overlapped with Valerie Goodchild, and I can't help but wondering if it was him that arranged for her to travel to England, if they had some pre-existing connection together. I mean, I'm not implying anything like romantic or anything like that, but I can't help wondering if there was a connection between Valerie Goodchild and Harold Richards, and what it was, and if he was the one responsible for bringing her in and looking after her and making sure she had some work to do and making sure that she could stick with the New Zealanders even after the New Zealanders left Egypt. And also interesting, I couldn't 100% confirm it, but some of the stuff in his military file strongly suggested that he too may well have been aboard the troopship the Maunganui in 1914 as a main body man, the same ship that carried my grandfather to war. At the same time and same place. So again, would be interesting to know if Captain Harold Richards was another one of these characters whose stories overlaps in some other way with my grandfather's story. Now, one of those newspaper stories mentioned in passing that Valerie Goodchild had been awarded an MBE, and it's mentioned in January of 1918 in the Gazette. And it's interesting to look at the people who were mentioned, because an earlier newspaper story before she arrived at Brockenhurst mentioned that there were 2 female ambulance drivers who were being overworked. There was Agnes Pearce, and there she is getting her MBE, and there was a Bell. There she is, Miss V.C. Bell. She got an MBE, and in that same list is Mrs. Elwyn Valerie Goodchild. They all got their MBEs at the same time. Now, I looked to try and find some suitable photos and couldn't really find it. This one on the top right was an event involving female workers from factories and hospitals. You see a bunch of nurses and factory workers attending a ceremony at Buckingham Palace. And this one is a group of Scottish nurses, the one on the left, Scottish nurses who attended some kind of function at Buckingham Palace. I wanted to find a better photo, but they were the best I could do. So she had received an award for the services, members of the Order of the British Empire. Now, if you're wondering what an MBE looks like, there it is. And yes, Ed Sheeran did get an MBE. Honestly, I don't know why successful pop stars who make millions of dollars also then turn around and get given medals by the Queen. Or now it would be the King, of course, but it was the Queen back then. I really don't quite understand that, but yes, Ed Sheeran did indeed get an MBE, and Valerie Goodchild too would have had a medal that looked like that. What happened to that medal? Who knows? Did it get thrown away or just end up getting auctioned off after she died in 1979? There's no way I could work that out. And then this letter about her career continues. She succeeded to the post of Commandant of Women Drivers at the New Zealand Hospital, Oatlands Park, and was subsequently transferred to headquarters, Bloomsbury Square, London, and promoted to Commandant of all of the New Zealand women's units. So, given how important and senior she rose within the ranks of the female military in World War One, you would think that her story would have been told before. But all of this it doesn't feature in any books, any articles, any TV shows, anything. This YouTube clip you're getting from me is the first time that Valerie Goodchild's story has been told. Now, this one on the top left, is that Valerie Goodchild? Well, it might be. I have no way of knowing. The photo doesn't tell you, but it is a female driver with 4 New Zealand soldiers driving around London. And this one here, well, there's the headquarters, and there are 3 females in the shot. I don't think any of them look like any of those other photos I've seen. Although this one on the bottom left, given how poor all my other photos are, could conceivably be Valerie Goodchild, although my own guess is it's probably not, but at least the physical similarity is close enough that it could be her. And I found some various pictures of what the New Zealand headquarters in London look like. Now, this one on the left from the New Zealand Army Museum um, doesn't match any of the others. And it's a horrible, poor photo anyway, but it doesn't look anything like the others. So my guess is this is an early photo, and the New Zealand military headquarters was in a different location earlier on and then got relocated, because all the other photos, and the one in Bloomsbury Square where Valerie Goodchild was stationed, match this image here. And here's some other photos of it. And Bloomsbury Square, I looked it up on a map, is just around the corner from the British Museum in London. And you can see very clearly New Zealand Military Headquarters, New Zealand. There's the General Pay Office, the administrative offices, a bunch of people gathering around. And interesting enough, this lamppost still seems to be there. The building itself is not. Did it get bombed in the Blitz, or did it just get knocked down and for another building to get rebuilt later? I don't know. But I went around on Google Street View and walked all of Bloomsbury Square, trying to work out on my computer exactly where it was to see if the building was still there. And I was able to match these buildings at the end of the street, but actually this building is completely gone, and it's been replaced by this one, which actually looks much nicer. But that lamppost there matches this lamppost here. So that survived, but none of the rest did. And this part here, well, the street's quite changed in nature on the left. And then her wartime service is over when 1919 comes around. She returned to Egypt on a New Zealand troop ship, the Kigoma, in 1919, and was demobilized at Port Said on the 2nd of December 1919. So her continued connection to the New Zealanders lasted through to the end of 1919. So the Kigoma was actually a ship that had belonged to the Germans and was handed over as part of the war reparations at the end of the war, so until very recently a German ship, and it was being used to transport New Zealand troops home. She went home via the Suez Canal, thereby stopping in Egypt, so this was a good way for Valerie Goodchild to get home to her home in Egypt. And it was interesting that I found a New Zealand list of passengers stating that Valerie Goodchild was expected to arrive in New Zealand aboard the ship. That was a mistake. I'm absolutely sure of that she did get off in Egypt. But of course, they would have had a passenger list of all the people who left with the New Zealanders from England, and therefore it just got published that she was arriving in New Zealand, but she wasn't. She was getting off in Egypt to return home to her husband. And I found these documents on Ancestry.com. They're passenger lists from British passenger ships arriving in England. There's one and there's another. And this is what they had to say. She went back to England twice. Once in 1927, aboard the ship the Mauritania, arriving in Southampton from Alexandria, with Elwyn V. Goodchild, which I found interesting. Not a Valerie Goodchild. Did this suggest that she was now calling herself Elwyn? But again, never a mention of her first name, Elsie. Elwyn V. Goodchild on board. It said she was going to stay at Dover Street in London, care of Barclays Bank. Well, I don't know what that means. And her occupation was housewife. It says she was aged 43. And it said country of future and intended residence, other parts of the British Empire. In other words, England is not my home. I live in Egypt. And the second time she returned to England was in September of 1933 aboard the ship Dempo that arrived in Southampton. And originally from Indonesia, but again, it came through the Suez Canal, and she must have got on board on its way to England. And this photo actually shows the depot at Port Said in Egypt. So this is, I think, when the passengers are getting off for a shore excursion. So probably Goodchild wouldn't be on that boat because this is when they're leaving the passenger liner and going ashore. But this could very well be the same time and place when Goodchild was going to board the ship and travel to England. And she's listed there as Goodchild, Alwyn V, occupation none, age 45, country of residence, Egypt. Now, there's something funny going on here. So in 1927, she was 43 years old. In 1933, 6 years later, she was 45 years old. So in 6 years, she had aged 2 years, gone from 43 to 45. Well, I guess she was one of these young ladies, shall we call her, who was economical with the truth when asked, "How old are you?" "I'm 45. "Yes, 45 plus how many?" But her story does not end there. She was a strong woman with a lot of ideas about she was going to get involved, and I found a reference to her from World War II, the Daily Mail from September of 1941. And actually, I found the same story repeated many times in American newspapers, Australian, New Zealand newspapers, but the first version seems to have been the Daily Mail. And the story was called The Woman Who Fishes for Mines. "There is here in Alexandria a woman of unusual courage, and she does occasionally and unofficially work of dire hazard. She is Mrs. Valerie Goodchild, the grey-haired and energetic secretary of the British Boat Club. Many times she's gone out at night with volunteer crews to spot mines and bombs in Alexandria Harbour. Of course I wear a steel helmet like the rest," she said, "and I have been in several raids. I would not have missed the experience of these exciting watches for anything." Now, most of the stories left this part out, but an Australian newspaper added some extra detail. I suspected most of the newspapers thought, well, maybe we'll leave that part out. It might reflect badly on somebody. She considers herself especially privileged and says that, though it is strictly unofficial, she feels she's entitled to be an exception to the no woman rule, since as club secretary she arranges the duty schedules for boats and crews. In other words, men only, no woman allowed. But she said, well, that rule doesn't apply to me, of course. I'm the one who organises the schedules. Of course, I can go out, even if other women can't. As I said, a woman of strong character who would decide what she wanted to do, and if somebody told her she wasn't allowed to, well, I think we'll just pretend we didn't hear that rule. No, 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 that rule doesn't apply to me. Thank you very much. And well, what was this all about? Well, the Germans would use submarines and sometimes planes to try to mine shipping routes and harbours that were of importance to the Allies. And there would, in fact, be these mines that would float into Alexandria Harbour. So they had these civilians who would go out on these little wooden dinghies and, mine spotting. And after they found them, they would communicate where they were, and then sharpshooters aboard the ships would shoot the mines and blow them up. So it was important work, and one ship hitting a mine could be an enormous amount of damage and many people dead. So it was important work that she was doing in 1941, still going strong, long after her World War One service was over. Now, after that, she doesn't really appear anywhere else. I mentioned in my first episode about her that she died in 1979, and the address she was living in Alexandria. And but even though we don't know what she was doing, it's rather incredible to think about her life in Egypt. She arrived in Egypt in 1910, so she was there when they all arrived. She was there for the Gallipoli Campaign, and except for going from 1916 to 1919 for England for service as an ambulance driver and mechanic and training these limbless men and all the rest, she lived all her life in Egypt. That means she was there all the way through World War II, the Battle of El Alamein and, against Rommel and all of the rest in World War II. And then all of the stories and things that happened in the Middle East subsequent to that. There was the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal, the Suez crisis involving the British and French and the Israelis. There were other Arab-Israeli wars. And when she died in July of 1979, one of the most recent events that had happened was when there was finally a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And President Carter was the American president at the time, and he managed to broker the deal. And I believe this was March of 1979. And there's Begin, Sadat, and Carter in Egypt in March of 1979, and Valerie Goodchild was still there. So much that she had seen, so much history that would have gone by, and Egypt would have changed so much between 1910 and 1979. I would love to know more, but beyond this, she was a civilian, a English woman living in Alexandria. What did she go through? What did she experience? Who did she know? Who did she interact with? Well, maybe one day I'll find more information, but so far I haven't got anything between that story from 1941 and just those little details of where she lived in Alexandria and ultimately her death in July of 1979. And of course, the grave of her husband and herself in Alexandria, which looks terrible. And goodness me, her husband got an OBE and did incredibly important work in the Middle East as a veterinary officer, ending World War I as a major. Valerie Goodchild herself did incredibly important work, and she deserves something better. Well, maybe I can't go to Egypt and repair her gravestone and put a proper headstone on their grave, but at least I can tell her story as I'm doing now. Took me an hour and a half to get there, but she does not deserve to be forgotten, and her story deserves to be told. And I've decided that I'm going to end every episode from now. Different YouTubers have different catchphrases that they end every episode with, and I've decided that I'm going to do that from now on. I'm going to borrow this picture and saying from my grandfather's radio shop in Wellington, from a newspaper advertisement, and I'm going to say to you, that's all I've got for you today, and good evening.